So she would ask some girls in one group, do you share your clothes with your friends? And they would say, yes, of course. That's what friendship is for. And in another group, for the same question, she would get an answer like, of course not. Everybody would notice. And to me, what's really beautiful about this kind of ethnographic research is how learning and belonging to a community really yielded different ways of being in the world, different sense of what it means to be yourself in relationship to others. In the same way that for the tailors, learning how to sew a suit was part of becoming a certain person. At that time, something happened to me that I want to share with you because I think it's a good example of what we were trying to capture. I was invited to a friend's house for dinner, and that friend served me a glass of wine. And he asked me, so what do you think? So I tried the wine, and I don't know much about wine. So I said, it's pretty good. And it turns out that he is a wine taster. And so he started to tell me what that glass of wine was to him. And you know these kind of carvings of the 16th century where you kind of open the sky and you see another universe? I had an experience like this because all of a sudden, that glass of wine, which for me was kind of okay, was this symphony of different tastes and chocolate and strawberry, and it was like this amazing description of something that for me just didn't exist. You know what I mean? And then he goes into this kind of trance state on this glass of wine, and he says, and this one has a really good purple in the nose. English is not my mother tongue, but I thought I understood nose, and I thought I understood purple, and yet what he was saying didn't make sense to me at all. Because apparently, for those of you who are not wine tasters, let me tell you that the nose he was talking about was not the nose of the person drinking the wine, because my first thought was, yeah, that's true, people who drink a lot of wine tend to have a purple nose. But that was obviously, I knew that's not what he was talking about, but apparently it's the wine that has a nose. There I was, we had the same glass of wine sitting across the same table, and so I think that the main difference between his experience of the glass of wine and mine was that his experience represented the practice of a community and mine didn't, because I don't belong to that community. And to me I was like, wow, yeah, this is very much the understanding of learning, the understanding of knowledge that we are trying to capture with this notion of a community of practice, with this notion of knowledge being part of human practice, is that we create a system of meaning in our communities. And as a learner, it is not enough to know the language. You have to really kind of enter the experience, the meaning through the experience of belonging to that community. There was a part of me that said, yeah, I'd like to learn how to do that. That would be fun. But then I also had to sort of think, well, I don't have time for that. I'm just going to stick with beer and move on. Appreciate that little window into this extraordinary world I've seen and move on with my life. So you can see, again, how my identity, my experience of who I was an important factor in allowing me to tell you without blushing that I still don't know what a good purple is in wine, because I'm not accountable to that community. See, I don't feel a sense of membership, and therefore what they know is a nice little curiosity as a tourist, but I don't feel personally accountable to that piece of knowledge. So the third section then will be engaging them in thinking, how does this perspective apply to schooling? Now, one thing that is interesting about that is that perspective has often been used to critique schools as an institution and to say there is a real problem with the view of knowledge that a school represents, which is a view of knowledge as something you can package in a curriculum and serve to students in a very sterile environment of a classroom. And so I'm going to ask them to reflect with me, if you are to be in a school, then how would you adopt a perspective like this as a way to engage the student in having a meaningful experience of learning as opposed to simply learning for the test? And so when you are with your students in the classroom and you are given a curriculum to impart to them, I would like to invite you to think about this sense of knowing as being a person in the world who is accountable or not accountable to certain locations, if you will, who has to manage an identity, who has to manage the becoming of who they are, and decide, is this for me? And why should it be for me? The reason I'm trying to convey that to you as future teachers is that my experience of how teachers are trained is very much in terms of imparting a curriculum. But this learning theory would suggest that imparting a curriculum is only a small part of what teaching is about. That the invitation of a person into who they are is actually another very, very important part of what it means to allow a person to see a new trajectory, to see a new way of being. The teachers who have had an impact on me in my education, they were always teachers who invited me into who they were. See, I still remember that teacher who read The Little Prince to us. And what was really significant is that he loved that story so much. And the way he was reading it to us. But I still remember to this day, that feeling I had of like, wow, if this is what it means to appreciate a book, I want to be that too. And to me, that remains to this day a very important part of the teaching about how to read. I'm not saying there's nothing technical about learning how to read. Obviously, you need to be able to decode the text. But again, this is only a small part of what learning is about, you see? And sometimes there is so much talk about the curriculum. What is the curriculum? How can we impart the curriculum? That we ignore, in fact, the most profound part of what it means to be a teacher, which is to invite students into a new way of being in the world. Think of your own profession. You are now being taught how to be a teacher. And so the university has taken the body of knowledge of pedagogy and teaching and has created a year program to impart this knowledge to you. I think you can think of the body of knowledge of the teaching profession as a landscape of different practices that are all in some sense competing and in some sense collaborating to create a view of what good teaching is. You have school headmasters who have their opinions of what should happen. You have perhaps parents, you have maybe professional societies. From a living standpoint, the body of knowledge is a system of different practices, all contributing in different ways to how the profession that you are entering is defined in the world and defined for you. And for you, as teacher, you have to see, how am I accountable to this? You could, from this theoretical perspective, describe the notion of a professional as someone who is representing a landscape of practices, the person who has to resolve these different places into a moment of like, what do I do with this student? Am I accountable to this piece of research? Am I accountable to this directive of my headmasters? Am I accountable to my own experience? It is true for your students also. They are also entering a landscape of different practices, but the landscape is actually complexifying. Do I follow this Twitter feed? Do I read this book? Do I read this research paper? As we move into a very information-rich society, the question of knowing and the question of learning is very much, where am I going to place my accountability? Well, the final section, I'm going to ask them to see themselves as learning citizens and to reflect on how they themselves act as learning citizens in the world today. And so I'm going to conclude this, invite you into thinking that in fact, the creation of an identity with respect to all these different practices, some of where you are a member, some where you are just a peripheral participant, discovering who you are in that landscape is actually at the very core, at the very center of what learning is about. So access to information is not your prerogative. You probably don't do this as well as Google. So don't think that access to information is the big deal about your being a teacher. You know? Do we know what to teach our kids so that they are ready for life? Can we claim to know that? I'm not even sure. It's a very good idea to think we're going to prepare those kids for life and we're going to give them the curriculum that they need. And how do you then, as learning citizens yourself in this world, become a guide, become an invitation to others to also learn how to manage who they are as a learner? Yes.
I'd like to thank you very much, Professor Wenger. I believe that the history of education in this country has been to provide a useful working force. And of course, that doesn't go very well with this idea of inspiration, although what you've said has been my own experience personally of life. That's the question. It's not a speech.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to enter the political conversation about whether schools should prepare people for work life or not. Because I think there's a whole conversation there about the role of schooling in a civic society and in an economy. What I have found is that today, even from an economic standpoint, the people who are high contributors in our society are people who are engaged, who engage their identity with something. And then they use that as a way to solve a problem, as a way to have a new idea.